I think we're going to see a very deliberate and considered effort, a campaign to punish Taiwan for welcoming Pelosi, to signal its isolation from its international partners, and to demonstrate how much has changed since the 30 years have passed since we last had, or 25 years have passed since we last had a crisis of this magnitude. And the military exercises that you have just discussed, which are noticeably closer to Taiwan than those that were conducted in 1995 and 1996 in what we call the third Taiwan Straits crisis, I think those are going to be the first step in a process of coercion of Taiwan. I think we'll also probably see some kind of economic pressure on Taiwan, comparable perhaps to that which China applied to Japan 12 years ago over a crisis in the East China Sea, when we saw a Chinese embargo on rare earth materials at the time. So we could see similar kinds of targeted economic pressure. And I think overall, we are entering into a much more dangerous period. There are also suggestions China could attack or seize an outlying Taiwanese island. I think those kinds of scenarios are considerably less likely. I think that China is more interested in signaling and in punishing than it is in actually initiating any kind of conflict. But we are entering into a much, much more dangerous period, I think.
And Shashank, with that danger, is there a risk of a confrontation that could be more than just a misstep?
There are always these risks when you have large forces in proximity and when Taiwan is concerned, where the stakes are very high, where US commitments are ambiguous, and both US and Chinese credibility is on the line. What I would say is, looking at these military exercises, this isn't just a show of force. This will also have political and economic consequences for Taiwan. So some of these activities, artillery firing, missile firing, naval drills, some of these are within 10 miles of Taiwan's coastline, much closer than previous drills. And if this begins to significantly disrupt air activity and maritime activity, civilian shipping, merchant shipping, civilian air traffic, we will begin to blur the boundaries between muscle flexing and a blockade or an embargo. And of course, blockades and embargoes, as we know from our experience in the Cuban Missile Crisis, our experience of Odessa in the Black Sea more recently, are very, very serious things, and they have the potential for great tension and confrontation in them.
How long would it take for that kind of blockade to impact Taiwan in terms of trade?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I'll be completely honest. As a defense analyst, I don't have a good answer to that because I don't know enough about the pattern of merchant shipping, civilian traffic in and out of Taiwan. But look, one of the wonderful things about modern technology is that you can all log on to a site like marinetraffic.com. You can see for yourself the sheer volume of shipping that throngs around Taiwan's ports every day. This is a huge economy, a very sophisticated economy that makes the best semiconductors in the world, has very high-tech industries on the island. You can see how busy Taiwanese ports are, how busy the Taiwan Straits are, how tightly integrated Taiwan is to other markets in Asia, including Australia and others across the world. And those ships are constant. So I think one thing I will be watching in the days ahead over the course of these activities, which I believe is scheduled to run for about 4 or 5 days, although I would double check that, that how much that chokes off this activity. I don't think China is going to seriously blockade Taiwan, for months and months. But I think what we are going to see is a possible signal, a hint as to what it is capable of doing. And that is going to put US, Japanese, Korean, Australian, other Asian credibility on the line, because it puts the onus of escalation onto other states. China is saying, we can do this around Taiwan, and if you want to stop us, you have to come and stop us and do it, which puts the onus of escalation onto you.
Yes, which changes the stakes really dramatically in the region. You know, we heard Sergei Lavrov sort of compare it to Russia's justification for the invasion of Ukraine. Is it concerning? You talk about coercion, perhaps in both economic and pressured ways for Taiwan, but is it concerning that China could look for a defensive argument to move on Taiwan in coming years and months even?
I think that in the past several years, the United States, and indeed in some ways all of us, have been very lucky to have a Taiwanese leadership that is very cautious. It is very careful about not pushing Chinese buttons. For example, anything that might be interpreted as a drive towards formal independence. And that has always been perceived to be the most significant of all the Chinese red lines. Not the only one. There are other provocations. The last major Taiwan Straits crisis was precipitated by a visit, not to Taiwan, but a visit of the Taiwanese leadership to the United States. So there are many things that can cause a crisis. But we've been lucky to have a leadership that has not pushed for independence, that has not pushed that particular button in provocative, dangerous ways. And that has resulted in breathing room for the United States to supply Taiwan with assistance, and indeed for other countries to intensify their support to Taiwan, often covertly, often very quietly and discreetly. And I would put Australia in that camp, by the way. What happens if China is able to point to these things as evidence that the US and others are changing the status quo on Taiwan, which is not true. It isn't true, but that's how China is seeking to portray it, is that it may not just justify Chinese activity, but by China talking this up, create a nationalist fervor within China that puts pressure on the leadership at a reasonably sensitive time in the way that you've been describing on your show, with the Party Congress coming up, Xi Jinping in a politically delicate moment. And of course, that is the time in which leaders sometimes feel compelled to take more risks than they otherwise would do.